What if one of Rome's strangest mysteries began not in a temple, but on a dusty road near the borders of Judea? In 29 BC, a Roman soldier named Gaius Plinius claimed that while on the march, he literally saw a different sky. It all happened during a patrol through harsh terrain not far from the Mediterranean Sea. The heat was crushing, the air shimmered, and then suddenly the familiar landscape seemed to have been replaced. Plinius wrote that the air abruptly turned cooler. The colors around him became brighter, and the ground beneath his feet no longer seemed the same. For a man who knew those places well, this sounded especially disturbing. Some historians believe it was exhaustion, heat, and stress. Others speak of a rare atmospheric phenomenon, when light distorts the sky and horizon beyond recognition. But there is a more important detail. Similar accounts appeared throughout the Roman Empire. Soldiers and travelers spoke of strange visions, alien landscapes, and places where the usual laws seemed to fail. By the way, if mysteries like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not myths but the most intriguing theories and sources. And yet Plinius's case did not vanish in the noise of legends. It survived in the text precisely because it seemed too unusual even for the ancient world. And then another Roman mystery appears, this time inside the temples themselves. Sources preserve reports of statues that seem to move on their own. Pliny the Elder, in his natural history, mentioned a statue of Jupiter in Ostia that supposedly changed position. Similar stories were told of other sanctuaries as well. From Lavinium to Ephesus, there is a rational explanation. Marble and bronze react to heat, cold, and humidity. A temple would grow scorching hot by day and cool down at night. The material expanded and contracted. Sometimes that was enough to cause a barely noticeable shift. But for an ancient person, even a few centimeters were not physics, but a sign from above. And so Rome left us not only roads and laws, but also questions that still have no final answer. Another question remained. What if it was not a miracle, but calculation? The Romans understood mechanics extremely well. They built lifts, water-powered devices, and temple automata. Ancient texts describe mechanisms that opened doors by themselves and moved figures during rituals. So the version of self-moving statues does not seem fantastical at all. Hidden pulleys, counterweights, rods, and air pressure could very well have created the effect of divine intervention. But this is exactly where the most unsettling part begins. Even when we have a reasonable explanation, the ancient accounts are far too insistent on the idea that the statues were not merely stone. For some believers, they served as conduits for the power of the gods. And in bolder versions, there is still no final answer. Natural phenomena, engineering illusion, or something else entirely. All the theories rest on isolated facts, but none closes the question completely. By the way, if historical mysteries like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not only myths, but also the real details behind them. And against this backdrop our gaze shifts to ancient China. In 1973, in Shandong province, archaeologists investigated the tomb of a nobleman from the state of Qi. The burial dated to roughly the 3rd century BC. Inside they found jade, pottery, and bronze weapons. But the main secret lay below. Beneath the principal tomb was a sealed chamber. It was covered by a heavy stone slab. The walls had been laid with rare precision. The chamber survived intact and had not been looted. And questions arose immediately. Why hide this space so deep? What did they want to preserve, conceal, or protect there? Relics, a secret ritual, a political shrine, or something history has already forgotten? There is still no answer. What if an entire caravan can disappear not in legend, but on a real trade route that for centuries linked east and west? That is exactly the kind of story that comes down to us from the Taklamakan Desert. It is one of the harshest stretches of the ancient Silk Road, where the sand can reshape the terrain in hours, and the daytime heat gives way sharply to nighttime cold. Around the 2nd century BC, merchants, envoys, and guides traveled through these lands. They carried silk, spices, stones, metals, and rare crafted goods. Caravans were the foundation of trade between China, Persia, and the lands known to the Roman Empire. The routes were guarded, the stopping places memorized, and the experience of the guides often decided everything. And yet one of these caravans, according to later accounts, vanished without a trace. No people, no animals, no cargo, as if the column had simply dissolved into the scorching air. Later authors added an important detail. This caravan was supposedly carrying especially valuable goods, perhaps treasures that could have attracted bandits or rivals. But even if an attack did occur, the main question remains. Where did the traces go? That is where the most disturbing part of the story lies. The desert knows how to hide evidence almost perfectly. A powerful sandstorm can bury people, animals and baggage in a matter of hours. Shifting dunes move sand from place to place for years. Archaeologists have repeatedly found ancient settlements and roads in Central Asia that lay buried under drifts for centuries. Theoretically, the caravan really could have been buried whole. But there is another version. The disappearance may have been the result of an attack. Robbers operated along the Silk Road, and a rich cargo made any caravan a target. By the way, if mysteries of antiquity like this interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we do not skim over myths, but examine the details that are usually missed. The problem is that even after a robbery, something usually remains. Fragments of bales, animal bones, pieces of harness, metal traces of a camp. That is why darker assumptions were born as well. Some link the disappearance to forbidden territory, the route's evil reputation, or a sacred cargo. For ancient people, such an interpretation was natural. The Silk Road was not only a road of goods, it was a road of rumors, fears, and legends. Any unexplained disappearance quickly acquired a mystical meaning. Today, the most reasonable explanation is still connected with the nature of the desert. The Taklamakan is vast, unstable, and merciless. It is capable of erasing a road, concealing a camp, and burying traces beneath layers of sand. But the complete absence of finds still leaves room for doubt, which means the story of the vanished caravan remains not just a road incident of the past, but one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient Silk Road. The Romans never found the answer. On the road at the foot of the Alps, carts suddenly began to roll uphill. Slowly, but stubbornly. Thus was born one of the strangest mysteries of the ancient world. We are talking about the Via Claudia Augusta. It was an important route linking Italy with the northern lands. Roman engineers knew how to measure gradients precisely, build embankments, and level roads. They rarely made mistakes. That is why the strange stretch of road genuinely baffled them. Carts stopped on the slope sometimes seemed to move against gravity on their own. Soldiers noticed this more than once, and so it was hard to explain everything away as simple carelessness. The first and most down-to-earth explanation is connected with an optical illusion. The terrain in such places often deceives the eye. The horizon is hidden. The surrounding slopes are unevenly inclined. Because of this, a slight descent can seem like an ascent. Such places are still known today. They are called gravity hills. A car in neutral there seems to drive uphill, though in reality it is slowly rolling downhill. But the ancient descriptions contain a curious detail. Observers spoke not only of the movement of the carts, they mentioned a strange sensation underfoot and the creaking of wheels, which heightened the trivogo. By the way, if historical anomalies like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine mysteries without unnecessary fantasies. It is precisely because of such details that the version of mere illusion does not sound conclusive to everyone. Another hypothesis also appeared. Some scholars of later eras suggested that lodestone might have been hidden in the rocks. The ancients already knew about the properties of magnetite. They noticed that it attracts iron. Hence the idea, what if there is a section beneath the road with an unusual magnetic field? The problem is that ordinary magnetism cannot move heavy wagons the way it was described. Much less can it make people feel as though the ground is behaving strangely. Modern research has not provided a firm answer either. The geology of the area is complex. Local anomalies are possible, but there is still no convincing mechanism. From the Alps, let us move to northern Peru. There rises Huaca del Sol, the Temple of the Sun. It is a gigantic pyramid of the Moche culture, which existed roughly from the 1st to the 8th century AD. It was built from millions of adobe bricks. Its height exceeded 40 meters. For its time, it was a colossal project, connected not only with rituals, but also with power. And here is the main oddity. Such an enormous structure has left almost no clear explanation of its purpose. Archaeologists found offerings, pottery, and traces of a complex labor organization, but there is no direct link to any specific deity. It is also unclear why the complex later fell into decline. Among the suggested causes are droughts, floods, political crisis, and internal conflicts. Each version sounds reasonable, but none of them closes the question completely. And then the mystery leads into the Nabatean desert. The Nabateans created a network of outposts along the trade routes of Arabia. They knew how to collect water, build reservoirs, and sustain life where there is almost no rain. Their settlements were pillars of trade and power, but then many of them were abandoned. After the kingdom was incorporated into the Roman Empire, some routes changed. The climate may also have become harsher. Droughts undermined even the most carefully designed systems. And yet the question remains, why did some sites survive while others vanished almost without a trace? It is precisely in such gaps that great historical mysteries are born. Why do entire settlements disappear without war? It is exactly such cases that trouble historians most. People simply leave, and the silence of the ruins becomes more frightening than any chronicles. One such mystery is connected with the Bunimi tablets in the Jordanian desert. They were found at the beginning of the 20th century near an ancient settlement that was probably an important religious or trading hub. World. The stone slabs preserved hundreds of signs. They look like part of a coherent writing system, but they still have not been deciphered. And this is where the strangest part begins. The symbols resemble Semitic scripts, including Aramaic and Phoenician, but the matches are incomplete. There is structure. There are repeating signs, there is order as well. But there is no confident translation. Dozens of tablets gave researchers a great deal of material for comparison, but even that did not lead to a breakthrough. So what we have before us is not random scratches, but a real language, or at the very least, a very complex recording system. Some scholars believe it is the trace of a vanished dialect. Others allow that the tablets were left by an isolated people who barely entered the broader history of the Middle East. There is also a more cautious version. The language may have been deliberately complicated by priests or the ruling elite in order to hide sacred knowledge from outsiders. By the way, if mysteries of the past like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine stories in which archaeology meets mystery. But even modern methods remain powerless so far. High-precision imaging, computer analysis, and systems based on artificial intelligence, that is why the Bunimi tablets remain a rare example of a text we possess, but for which we have no key. Another mystery takes us to North Africa. On the territory of modern Libya there was an oasis settlement that had flourished since at least the 3rd century BC. It had everything needed for a long life. Water from natural springs, agriculture, trade links between the interior regions of Africa and the Mediterranean. Such a place should have grown for centuries, but it disappeared almost without a trace. Archaeologists found no signs of invasion, fires or mass burials, nor are there signs of severe drought. Moreover, the water sources continued to function for a very long time after the inhabitants had left. This is especially important. It means the settlement did not perish because of a sudden natural catastrophe. There are several versions. Perhaps an internal crisis was at work, a struggle among elites, the collapse of authority, or the disruption of trade routes could quickly undermine the stability of even a wealthy center. There is also an environmental version, not a sharp drought, but a slow worsening of conditions. Harvests may have declined year after year until people realized they could no longer stay. But no theory explains everything completely. And so yet another mystery appears on the horizon. Now Spain, Andalusia. In the remote hills there is a well that locals call the Whispering Well. It is not just an old water source. According to eyewitnesses, if you approach the edge and listen carefully, a quiet whisper rises from the depths. Some consider it an acoustic effect. Others speak of voices from the past. And it is with this mystery that the next chapter begins. This fragment already carries us farther, from the Spanish well to another ancient enigma. The Romans left many records of omens, but one of the most chilling concerned headless shadows that supposedly appeared before battles. Soldiers saw them at the edge of the firelight, where the glow of campfires met the darkness of night. The figures resembled people, but they had no heads. They glided silently between the tents. Sometimes they appeared before dawn, when the camp was still living in anxious ogydinia. For the Romans, this was not empty superstition. They genuinely believed that the gods sent warnings through birds, dreams, and strange visions. Military leaders consulted priests. The priests interpreted the signs and could even influence the decision to begin a battle. That is why such shadows inspired especially intense fear. Their appearance was considered a harbinger of disaster. In the stories, animals were sometimes mentioned beside them as well, more often birds or horses, and that only strengthened the link with death and fate. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine ancient mysteries without unnecessary mysticism and with reliance on sources. One of the most famous stories is associated with the Teutoburg forest. It is the year 9 AD. There Rome lost 3 legions at once in a Germanic ambush. Later authors wrote of a dark headless figure that supposedly appeared shortly before the catastrophe. For posterity, it became a symbol not merely of defeat, but of the end of Roman influence in that region. There is another grim example, the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. Hannibal's army crushed the Romans, and this defeat became one of the heaviest in the history of the Republic. In some accounts, the headless shadow supposedly entered the commander's tent and came back out again like a mute herald of the coming slaughter. Historians offer more earthly explanations. Before battle, people lived under monstrous strain, lack of sleep, fear, smoke, flickering fire, and the expectation of death easily distort perception. In such conditions, shadows seem alive, and collective anxiety quickly turns a chance silhouette into a shared vision. But there is also a cultural layer. Roman thinking was structured in such a way that any unusual event was read as a message. The headless figure could become an image of lost control, or a symbol of death already walking through the camp and choosing its victims. And yet the most curious thing lies elsewhere. These stories outlived the battles themselves, which means the soldiers were struck not only by fear, but by a sense of doom that cannot be forgotten. That is why the headless shadows remained in history, not as a proven fact, but as an unsettling trace of an age in which war, religion, and human terror merged into a single whole. And ahead of us lies yet another mystery of the ancient world, no longer in forests and camps, but among the sands of old trade routes, where archaeologists found strange desert glass. First came fire from the sky. About 29 million years ago, a meteorite or comet exploded over the Sahara. The shockwave was so powerful that the silica-rich sands melted and turned into glass. That is how Libyan desert glass came into being. It is not a human-made object, but a rare gift of catastrophe. It is found in the form of large translucent pieces. Sometimes they are as big as a human head. In the sun, such fragments gleam with gold and green. They look almost unreal. But even more astonishing than the origin of the glass itself is the path it traveled through the ancient world. The ancient Egyptians valued this material very highly. It was used to make amulets, inlays for jewelry, and ritual objects. The most famous example is connected with the tomb of Tutankhamun. Among his burial treasures is a golden scarab with a core made from this glass. That is an important detail. It shows that the material was perceived not simply as a beautiful rarity, but as something with special meaning. And this is where the real mystery begins. Archaeologists find objects made of desert glass far from the places where it originated, and not just isolated shards but whole clusters of items, often near ancient campsites and trade hubs. We are talking about routes that linked Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and Mesopotamia. For their time, these were the main arteries of exchange, which means the glass was not simply carried around casually. It was deliberately transported over great distances. Why? There is still no answer. One theory speaks of sacred value. In Egyptian tradition, rare heavenly materials were easily associated with the gods and the power of the sun. Glass that shone brightly in the rays could have seemed like frozen light. Such an object could very well have become a religious relic. By the way, if mysteries of antiquity like this interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not myths, but the strangest details of history. There is another theory as well, a bolder one. In the ancient world, the boundary between craft, magic, and ritual was very thin. So objects made of desert glass may have been used in rites where light, rarity, and the heavenly origin of the material were important. A more practical explanation is not impossible either. Because of its beauty and rarity, the glass may have served as a valuable trade good long before familiar monetary systems. But the mystery does not end there. Next, historians turn their attention to Aksum. This was an ancient state on the territory of modern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Aksum was a major trading power. Its influence reached Rome, Arabia, and India. The port of Adulis was especially important. Ancient authors described it as a bustling harbor full of ships and goods. Today, all that remains of Adulis are ruins and pottery. And that is striking. A city that stood at the crossroads of maritime trade seems to have dissolved into time. Historians explain this by climate change, economic decline, and the shift of trade routes after the rise of the Islamic states in the 7th century. All of that sounds logical. But there is a problem. The disappearance was too complete. That is why researchers are left with a sense that something remains unsaid. It is unclear why some of Aksum's coastal settlements were never rebuilt. It is unclear why the traces of life end so abruptly. Hence the more troubling hypotheses: earthquakes, tsunamis, a sudden catastrophe, or events that simply never made it into the chronicles. The ruins of Adula still stand as a reminder of how many blank spots ancient history conceals. And against this backdrop, another oddity appears. This time in Egypt itself, in a civilization that carefully counted people, land, and taxes. An entire nome, that is, an administrative district, seems to drop out of the documents. For a state where record-keeping was the basis of power, this is almost unthinkable, which means another mystery lies ahead. Egypt knew how to count everything: people, grain, taxes, warriors. Royal officials kept censuses so meticulously that they could show which region was prosperous and which was starving. But it is precisely against this background that the oddity emerges. One of the most important nomes seems to have vanished from the papers. We are talking about Thinis. This is a region of Upper Egypt that many consider the cradle of the early kingdom. It is associated with the first dynastic rulers and the era of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. In other words, not some remote backwater, but a place that stood at the origins of Egyptian statehood. And yet in the official censuses, Thinis is almost invisible. This is especially strange because archaeology says the opposite. In Abydos, which was its ceremonial center, royal tombs, temples, large structures, pottery, tools, and inscriptions have been found. What we have before us is not a myth, but a real and influential region. The simplest explanation sounds dull. Fire, damp, time, and human carelessness destroyed countless documents of the ancient world. Perhaps the records of Thinis simply did not survive to our time. But there is a problem here. The Egyptian system of record-keeping functioned for centuries. The complete disappearance of data on such a significant nome looks far too unusual. And this is where things get most interesting. Some historians allow for the possibility that the disappearance was not accidental. If Thinis was the stronghold of the first dynasties, later rulers may have seen its past as a threat to their own legitimacy. In the ancient world, that happened often enough. A new vlast altered inscriptions, appropriated the achievements of predecessors, and erased inconvenient memory. By the way, if mysteries of antiquity like this interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not only myths, the past. In that case, the absence of censuses becomes not an archival accident, but a political gesture. Remove the documents, and over generations the very memory of who stood at the origins of the country. It could have been a quiet but very effective way of rewriting the history of Egypt. Of course, there are bolder versions too. In the culture of ancient Egypt, the will of the gods was seen in almost everything. So later stories may have appeared about divine punishment or a curse that supposedly erased the traces of Thinis. But such explanations tell us more about Egyptian thinking than about the real reasons for the disappearance of the papers. Most likely, the choice lies between two versions. Either the documents perished, as thousands of other papyri did, or they were deliberately destroyed in order to weaken the legacy of an overly important region. And in this question, there are still more mysteries than answers. And next, an entirely different enigma awaits us, not from the Nile Valley, but from ancient India. There, in the texts of the Mahabharata and the Vedas, there appears a being described as a beast with a human face. And the more carefully you read these lines, the harder it becomes to understand what exactly stands before us. A symbol of forgotten reality, or the trace of something the ancient authors simply did not know how to name. The remains of the walls of Kiryat al-Fa still cling to the rocks. The gates have survived. The inscriptions have survived. And all of this hints at a city whose role may have been far more important than is commonly believed today. It stood on ancient routes that linked the Arabian Peninsula with Mesopotamia and the Levant. Through such hubs passed frankincense, myrrh, and rare spices, and along with goods came ideas, customs, and faith. The city was not just a market, it was a crossroads of merchants, scholars, and pilgrims. But by the first centuries of our era, It was already deserted. And here is what especially troubles historians. There are no signs of a great war, no signs of fire, no mass burials either. It is as if the inhabitants simply left, quickly, in an orderly way, and left houses, temples, and markets frozen in time. By the way, if mysteries of antiquity like this interest you, here we examine not legends, but the strongest theories and the facts. One theory speaks of drought for Arabia, but archaeology does not give a simple answer. There are no convincing signs of the complete disappearance of water. Moreover, local societies knew how to survive in a harsh climate. They built wells, stored water, and created irrigation systems. So a natural disaster alone does not explain everything. Another theory is connected with trade. When the caravan routes shifted, the city may have lost its income and significance. That is closer to reality. Economic decline often kills cities more quietly than any war. But even here the question remains, why was the exodus so swift? And this is where the most unusual explanations begin. Local legends tell of a people who left the city in a single night after an omen. Perhaps the priests or elders decided that disaster was approaching. For an ancient society, such a step was not unthinkable. On the Arabian Peninsula, the bond between religion, the sky, and everyday life was very close. If people believed the gods were commanding them to leave, that could become the decisive order. From the sands of Arabia, we seem to be carried to another mystery. In southern Egypt, near Jebel Barkal, lies a giant unfinished statue of Nubia. This place was the sacred center of the kingdom of Kush. Amun was worshipped here. Kings and queens were buried nearby. The statue itself, carved directly into the rock, was meant to become a monument about 10 meters high. The face and upper part are worked with great care. But below, the work seems to break off abruptly. The arms, legs, and torso were left unfinished. Why? The simplest explanation is a change of power. The ruler died, turmoil began, and the project was halted. But the abruptness of this stoppage seems too strange. That is why other versions appeared. The place may have been considered unlucky, or the statue itself may have been left unfinished deliberately, if a completed image was seen as a vessel of sacred power. There is yet another thought. The abandoned statue may have become a silent sign of the decline of Kush itself, a state that in time lost its influence, history. And finally, one more mystery of the ancient world. A bronze map of the world. Ancient authors wrote about it, above all Pliny the Elder. According to him, there existed in Rome a huge map made of bronze that showed the entire known world of that time, from Britain to Africa and the lands of the East. The very material is astonishing. Bronze for such a work meant enormous expense, precision, and ambition. But there is a problem. No modern researcher has ever seen the map itself. No reliable trace of it remains. It is unknown who commissioned it, an emperor wishing to display the scale of his empire, or a wealthy patron of knowledge. Another thing is also unclear: where it stood. In a public place, in a palace, or in a great hall. And then it vanished. Perhaps it perished in unrest. Perhaps it was lost, or perhaps it was hidden deliberately. 3 mysteries: a vanished city, an abandoned statue, a missing map, and each of them reminds us of one thing. History preserves not only answers, it preserves voids that sometimes speak louder than any chronicle. Some see in the bronze map the work of an unnamed scholar, not merely a geographer, but a man who believed in a simple idea: whoever understands the structure of the world can govern it more easily. Others think it was a diplomatic gift. Such an object could emphasize the power of Rome, its knowledge, and its vast reach. But there is also a bolder version. The map may have been not only a tool, it may have carried a symbolic or even secret meaning. In antiquity, maps often showed not only roads, rivers, and cities. They also expressed an era's idea of the order of the world. Later, the Roger map played a similar role in the 12th century. It united geography, science, and philosophy. That is why the Roman map, too, may have been something greater than a mere diagram of lands. The disappearance of this map only deepens the mystery. It may have perished in a fire. It may have disappeared during the sack of Rome. It may have been carried far away and forgotten in some foreign repository. There is another version as well. Its creator may have hidden it personally, so that the knowledge would not fall into Chujiaruki. Or perhaps the bronze was simply melted down for new needs, and with the metal vanished the memory of its significance. Here is what is especially important. Ancient authors mention the map, but archaeology is silent. No fragments have been found, no reliable descriptions. It is precisely this gap that troubles historians. By the way, if mysteries of the past like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not legends, but the most gripping historical enigmas. Perhaps the map still lies in a forgotten archive, or beneath layers of earth. Or perhaps the greatest mystery is not even its disappearance, but the very fact of its existence. It hints that the ancients may have imagined the world as far more complex than we are used to thinking. And here another silence of history arises. In the northwest of ancient Gaul lived the Veneti. They were a seafaring tribe from the coast of what is now Brittany. They built sturdy ships, controlled trade routes, and knew well the dangerous tides of the Atlantic. After the campaigns of Julius Caesar, their fate is abruptly lost. It is known that in 56 BCE, but after that, a void begins. There are no clear records of complete extermination, no traces of a major migration, no certain signs that their lands were seized by another people. The Veneti simply disappear from the sources, and that is why their story remains one of the strangest mysteries of ancient Gaul.